merci d'être revenu, voilà, pour la reprise. Alors, ce petit film publicitaire est quand même assez inspirant. On voit que le rêve d'un enfant, voilà, peut s'incarner plus tard. Alors, comment voir grand, quoi? Alors, nous poursuivons cette troisième session sur les changements climatiques et la gestion des catastrophes avec deux autres présentations. Et la prochaine porte sur l'administration des terres, les catastrophes naturelles et les changements climatiques. Donc, on fera le lien encore plus directement entre les changements climatiques qu'on observe, évidemment, depuis plusieurs années et les catastrophes qui en découlent. Alors, nous avons avec nous l'un des deux présidents du groupe de travail 7.2 de la commission 7 de la FIG, portant sur l'administration des terres et les changements climatiques. Il s'agit de M. JaapZevenbergen, professeur et directeur de la chaire en gestion du territoire à l'Université de Twente aux Pays-Bas. Il est directeur de l'École de l'Université des Nations Unies en études foncières, un programme conjoint, Cadastre ITC, de développement des capacités. Alors, M. Zevenbergen, je vous invite à vous approcher et vous allez intervenir aussi au nom de votre collègue et co-auteur David Mitchell, qui est professeur d'arpentage et de développement foncier, au Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology en Australie, qui est donc coprésident avec vous du même groupe de travail. Et voilà, alors je vous laisse la parole pour nous présenter ce travail conjoint.
Merci madame. Bonjour madame et messieurs, je m'appelle JaapZevenbergen. En français, c'est Jacques 7 Montagne. Je suis professeur d'administration et gestion des terres aux Pays-Bas. Ma présentation sera la seule présentation en anglais ce matin. So I will continue. As you can see, the title has three elements. Land administration, natural disasters and climate change. These are three words that all passed by already during the conference earlier this day and yesterday. It was one FIG working group, and it represents a myriad of links, most of them still underdeveloped. And I will start at the bottom, so we'll go from climate change and work our way back up to land administration in this presentation this morning. Here we can see some of the predictions that the IPCC has brought out on the climate change effects. We are all aware of the global aim to keep it at 2 degrees, but we are currently on different trajectories, predicted trajectories that run over it. What does it have to do with land? Well, land use change, and forestry are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we change using the land, when we cut down trees, we are really contributing. Of course, urban areas are main centers of consumption and emissions. This also makes them areas where there's opportunities for a lot of reduction. And therefore they play an important role in climate change as well. And rural areas, of course, make up a quarter of the Earth's surface. And the soil and plants hold 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. So if we are careful with the rural areas and even improve how much they hold, we have something big to work with. What are some of the likely impacts of climate change? Well, one of the impacts, and that's why the title is as it is it increases the chance and the severity of different natural disasters. Of course, it increases climate variability. So one year it will be more dry, another time there will be more rain, or more snow, or more ice rain here in Quebec. Rising sea levels and increased coastal storm surges can occur. So people on the coastlines are extra at risk for that. And we see, of course, a lot of glaciers melting, which is affecting water supplies. Here's some predictions on the increases in the water table level in the figure. And this is another one where some of the perhaps less evident effects of rainfall or changes in rainfall patterns and also changes in glacier existence are shown. And for instance, for me, a bit closer to home, if you look at the area around the Mediterranean in Europe, on the south side of the Alps, one of the things that could happen is that actually some of the hydro dams that produce electricity will nearly run dry because of some of these changes in the water runoff. Then I move to natural disasters. What is a natural disaster? I didn't want to give you an official definition, but basically it's an event that cannot be handled locally and needs outside support. Well, of course, we saw a few very big ones earlier today. Natural disasters vary in intensity and impact, and they include geophysical disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis. Well, we already saw 2 very heavy earthquakes earlier today. They're not extremely frequent, but if they come, they have nearly no warning. So they kind of just happen. The second type is hydrometeorological disasters. And then we can think of floods, cyclones, hurricanes, or whatever they are called in different parts of the world, typhoons. Here we maybe have some warning, depending on where it hits. Even a big rainfall, when it hits you and it floods the area that is hit, you have almost no warning except maybe through weather reports. But sometimes the rain is more upstream on a river system, and then of course the flooding in the high area might be quick, but down the river you might have some time knowing that it's coming, like we saw in Pakistan twice, I think, the last few years. And the third type of a natural disaster is drought. Often we forget this one because it's a bit different. It is a slow type of disaster, and in some areas it might be seasonal, but the effects, of course, are as damaging and even lead to civil wars, like in cases like Darfur, where there is a clear incidence that the change of the rain patterns has influenced how different communities moved in the area and then also moved into each other's territories. Impacts of disasters are very specific from country to country, and some communities are more resilient than others. I think that was very clear again this morning in our first presentation, where we saw that the Chile earthquake, which was almost 2 points higher on the scale than the Haiti one, killed, and that was even not mentioned, but I think around 100 people, because there was much more preparedness and the communities were much more resilient. Of course, the second 2 types of disasters mentioned here, all the ones relating to rain, water, flooding, as well as drought, are very much affected by climate change. The occurrence of geophysical ones, of course, probably not. We have seen an increase in reported natural disasters. You see it's quite strongly going up. And interestingly, or unfortunately, it's really unfortunately and therefore interesting to mention, I should say, is that a research by the World Bank has shown that 95% of the people who get killed in natural disasters live in developing countries. We also see that countries in Asia are among the most disaster prone, so many different disasters hit in most of Asia. And especially small independent, small island developing states like in the Pacific region or in the Caribbean are among the most vulnerable because they have almost nowhere to go. I've seen the disaster or hazard risk maps of some of the Caribbean island states, and half the island is not safe because of the volcano, and the rest of the island is too close to the water. So when a hurricane comes, it will flood. So then there's nowhere to live on the island if you want to be absolutely safe. And the UNDP already 10 years ago has estimated that the economic losses of disasters have also enormously increased. In the 1960s, we were talking about 75 billion, and now we are already almost 10 times as much, and I'm sure it has continued. What is a disaster? Basically, a disaster means that a hazard has occurred and did create a lot of damage, injury, and death. There are also volcanic eruptions in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody is bothered by that. They don't make any damage and they don't make any injuries or deaths. And that's why there is at the bottom kind of a formula, if you like, from the disaster risk management field, which says risk is a combination of hazard and the element at risk. And an element at risk usually is a person, but can also be a construction. And so in areas where there are no buildings, where there are no people, where there are no human activities, a hazard doesn't create a risk. But with the increased population, more and more places we have people and buildings, so more and more hazards do turn into risks. What about land in relation to this? Well, we can see that land really influences vulnerability, land issues, and vulnerability influences land systems. Because we can see that the land system creates vulnerability. Poor people who have little choice, who move into the cities, who cannot afford to maneuver the official system of getting access to land, end up in informal settlements or slums. And where are these slums and informal settlements located? They are always located where the official system has not moved or not moved quickly. And this is very often floodplains, very slopey areas, other areas that, according to hazard risk analysis, should not be used for human habitation. So it also means that when the event might hit in that area, it's the people in those areas that are extra hard hit by the event. Of course, when a natural disaster hits, it impacts the land to humankind relation. It impacts the way people live, where they live, how they make their livelihood. And we saw that again very clear this morning. Of course, very extreme in the case of Haiti, but also in New Zealand you could clearly see how many houses cannot be used, how many employment positions are disappeared and have to either move out of the region or go into temporary shelters. And we also see that the way we respond with regard to land issues after a natural disaster really affects how resilient the community, the people are left in the cycle for the next disaster. Because ultimately, you can say as soon as a disaster has happened, we are dealing with that one, but we're also, by definition, in the preparation phase for the next one, whenever it will come. But we're almost sure it will come at some point. Why does this give so much trouble? And we already saw the story of Haiti very clear this morning. Is because there is in many, many places a legal and administrative tenure duality or plurality. There might be an official system covering a few % of the population who is rich and connected. There might be others still under a traditional, customary or indigenous system. There might be people outside of the law in informal or extra-legal situations. It's very difficult after a disaster to verify what kind of relation people had before to their land. Even when it was all documented, more or less, but especially when it was not. It's very difficult to verify so-called secondary rights after a disaster. So people who were not even occupying and feeling that they owned the place, regardless of what the law said. No, but people were actually paying somebody else rent because they are renting access to the place. They were leasing or they were a tenant. These secondary rights are even more difficult to deal with. And in many countries, informal settlers, people in slums, have been there for a long time. So they might even have what we can call a socially legitimate right. But that was usually not documented. And then it becomes very hard to prove. And it also leads to very strange effects. People not willing to be evacuated because their only claim to their land is their presence there. They have the right of occupancy, that's their only right. So as soon as they are moved out, they are not in occupation. And then stand a big chance of losing their right. So it also creates extra vulnerability, but also danger that people sometimes don't want to be moved away because they want to keep at least the connection to the land that they have. So it's clear that we need to document all these different rights and tenures that people have in a simple way with land tools like the STDM. I'm sure we'll hear more about that after lunch. And this is all related to the continuum of rights which you see here at the bottom. Because tenure security is really having a big impact on if a community is resilient or vulnerable. And here are some elements. Because of time, I will not go through all of them. But you can see there are different components that have an influence on how you can make a community more resilient, more prepared, more ready to deal with a disaster when it hits. But all these elements are influenced by the competition for land. So in an area where there's a lot of land and there's very little discussion about access to land, it's much easier to feel safe that it is your land. But if there's a lot of pressure on the land, or the land is very valuable, this will be much more complex to make sure that you have a security of your land. And if you are not secure in your land, then as said, all kind of bad effects come into place, both in being prepared for the disaster and later on in dealing with it. So to manage disasters, I put it between quotes, there has been developed the disaster risk management framework, which makes a distinction between 3 phases. And basically it sounds very logical. We have the phase before the disaster, we have the response immediately after the disaster, and most disasters last very short. Earthquakes and tsunamis can be a matter of minutes that they hit. Floodings, of course, can stay on a bit longer. And then we have the post-disaster recovery and reconstruction phase. Once things have settled down, the wounded have been taken care of, people have been evacuated, the deaf, those who died have been taken out and buried. We have to start working on the future again. And the picture here is actually from the tsunami in Banda Aceh during the Christmas tsunami in, was it 2004, in Indonesia. And you can see it here in a more graphical way. You see the 3 phases once again. You also see at the bottom the media response. And that's also interesting because it came out already this morning, that when something happens, the media is interested, but that very quickly slips away. Whereas the attention needed, even to take care of immediate, but certainly of longer-term effects, will be there for a long time. Even in Christchurch, they were talking about, 2030 before things are more or less back to normal. So then we're talking almost 20 years in such a developed situation. And the media has long left the region. So in the pre-disaster phase, we have to do ongoing disaster mitigation. We have to do risk assessment, know where the risks are. We have to work on prevention to avoid adverse impacts of the hazard. We have to take mitigation measures to limit the adverse impact, and we have to be prepared. And we are prepared for certain things in certain places. I think the big tragedy of the tsunami part of the Japanese earthquake was that they were actually prepared for earthquakes, they were prepared for tsunamis, but they were prepared for tsunamis to a certain height. And this surge was higher. So people actually went up high places were still killed because that high place was based on the last 100 years of tsunamis, and this one was higher. So that is always the problem. We can only prepare for what we choose to be prepared for. Of course, it's important, and that links very much to yesterday, that we have to do very good analysis of where the hazards are. So for instance, for flooding, we have to look like things of landslides in this case. We have to look like things like the slope, what is the rainfall pattern in this area, what type of land use do we have, any underlying geology. And then we can get a susceptibility to landslides. And then of course, if we overlay this with human presence or buildings, etc., we get into the real risk. We also have to integrate this type of disaster risk reduction into land administration. And we have to ensure that the policies and legal frameworks are consistent with the way described in the voluntary guidelines for governance of tenure to protect vulnerable people. We have to incorporate knowledge of the hazard risks in land use planning and property development. Often we also do things that we kind of should know that are not very wise, but we do them anyway because of other drivers. And in countries, of course, where getting a building permit has more to do with whom you know or who you give closed envelopes to than with any planning insight or other informed decisions, we can have a lot of trouble. We can provide facilities to recognize property rights of people that are resettled. We can already prepare some of this as well. We can also relocate people in advance and make sure that they are in a safer place and also get better tenure security there. We have to inform people about property rights. We have to inform the relevant staff and the records and the infrastructure to be safe from natural hazards, not as the picture I just showed you where basically the land records of the town were in heaps, completely wet in front of the office. An example of where they actually did some relocation and improved in the meantime people's tenure security without breaking their livelihood, because that's often also a case. If we relocate people to a safer place, they might lose the access, at least the easy access, to their way of living. If you are a fisherman, you want to live close to the sea. And if you are working in the downtown center, you don't want to live 1 hour commuting from there. And if we move people far away, the chance that they get killed in a road accident might be bigger than that they get hit by the next natural disaster. So in this case, the housing was moved out of an area that was considered very unsafe. They still had access to that area for certain livelihood activities, but they also got much improved tenure security, certificates for their land tenure rights there. I think we can skip this one. In the emergency response, there is, of course, one thing that happens is that a lot of people are displaced after disaster. We saw all the pictures of the tents this morning, especially in the Haiti case. Of course, there's a range of ways to deal with transitional shelter. The quality of the shelter may also be progressively improved. There's always the expectation that they are short-term, but often they are not. You have to also be careful where you put temporary shelters, because there are quite some big cities that started as a temporary camp, and if that is in a place with lack of water, or which itself is again in a floodplain or whatever, that is of course very difficult. Early considerations of land issues also help in all the different steps, and we can include some questions on land issues also in some of the assessments that are done by people in camps shortly after disasters. An effective land administration can help here to identify the suitable locations for the transitional shelter, so we can already plan for a possible disaster in the future by already indicating areas where it's safe for people to be moved to. We also need to understand and respect the tenure security of the host communities. Otherwise, we are creating a new land conflict. And we have to keep records of people in post-disaster settlements and recognize their tenure rights. And especially just after the shock of the disaster, you can ask people a lot and get their honest responses. Land issues have materialized in many earlier disasters. Material threats for displacement, land grabbing, coercion. There are also people who profit from anything. Whatever happens, they manage to get a profit from it. There is material threats from destruction. There are administrative threats, when the capacity is low, or when people are somehow ignored. And there, of course, are human rights threats, where there's discrimination or inappropriate land acquisition and compensation. So poor tenure security makes people more vulnerable to the disaster, but also makes them more vulnerable after the disaster. And especially poor people, elderly, women, children, minority groups, are always among those that are vulnerable. And one of the lessons from Aceh was that very quickly a massive rebuilding of housing started. I think in the end they actually built too much houses. But what turned out is that after a while, after a few years, there were still some groups left in the shelters, and this was especially some of the vulnerables, also people who were renting, had a secondary right, which were forgotten in the immediate regulations. In the recovery phase, we have to resolve claims to land, which people had prior, because we cannot do reconstruction and want to avoid future land disputes. So we have to know what we are and where we are reconstructing. And I think this is what became a really, really big problem in the Haiti case. In this adjudication, we also have to recognize both legal claims, but also socially acceptable claims. We need information on the tenure and the households. And as said, when we do that early on in the post-disaster assessments, we have a good base to know approximately what numbers we are dealing with. And for instance, in Aceh, the local communities, with support from both NGOs and the National Land Agency, did massive land inventories afterwards. There were good guidelines for this, and a lot that was also the base for extensive community mapping and community planning, as you can see on the poster. We have to protect land markets and different responses. In Aceh, for a while, it was not allowed to transact at all. And in the Japanese case, there was an announcement that if things would move, if the market would start behaving strangely, the government might interfere. So there was a warning given. This is especially against speculation and people strategically moving into places. We have to skip the example and go to the concluding remarks. And there we see that land administration has a role to play in preventing and dealing with natural disasters. When we plan well, we can also make sure that in the most vulnerable places, most unsafe places, people don't get. We have to realize that the weaker are often hit the most by disasters. And that also means that only inclusive land administration that creates enough safe access to safe land for everybody to be located or relocated on can really help. Because if we ignore the people in the slums, they are at risk. If we push them out of the slums with some kind of force, they will move somewhere else. And as long as there's no organized safe places created for them, they'll just create the next slum in the next unsafe place. And it also means that we have to accept all the legitimate tenures of the whole population if we really want to make everybody more safe. We have to realize that climate change is increasing the chance of certain natural disasters from happening, especially flooding, along the coast, but also from rivers. And that means that also more areas are becoming unsafe, to use a non-technical term. Of course, geospatial data plays a role in hazard risk assessment, and we need proper, fit-for-purpose approaches to recording the land and mapping the land, which will inform us when we make policies in the prevention phase before a disaster has hit, and will support post-disaster work, both immediate as well as in the little bit longer term. Well, the time went exactly on 0 now, so I'll only show this very last one, where you can, in the figure, see a combination of climate change on the left and disaster on the right. And in the middle, you see that the two are linked because certain types of disasters will occur more due to climate change. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Sept-Montagne. Alors, ce sera un plaisir de vous retrouver dans la table ronde tout à l'heure, pendant cette table ronde.